March 1945. A small German town somewhere west of the Rhine. The fighting has already passed through. What remains is silence, heavy, unfamiliar, almost unsettling. Roofs have collapsed inward. Window glass crunches under boots. Smoke still rises from a factory yard where machines will never run again. From behind cellar doors and shattered door frames, civilians begin to emerge. Slowly, cautiously, women wrapped in coats that no longer keep out the cold. Elderly men moving with the stiffness of hunger. Children watching without blinking. They expect shouting, orders, perhaps violence. Instead, American soldiers pause in the street. Their uniforms are dusty, faces hollowed by weeks of advance. One kneels, setting his rifle against the wall. Another reaches into his pack and pulls out a small brown box, a K ration. He opens it carefully, as if the moment requires precision. The sound of metal tabs snapping echoes louder than gunfire ever did. A loaf of compressed bread, a tin of meat, chocolate, coffee powder. The civilians stare. Some step back, unsure if this is a test. Then the soldier holds the food out, not as a command, but as an offer. In that instant, years of propaganda begin to crack, and the war, in one narrow street, reveals a different face. The meaning of that moment can only be understood by looking backward, to how Germany arrived here, hungry, fearful, and stunned by mercy. By the spring of 1945, Germany was a nation physically shattered long before it formally surrendered. The collapse had not come suddenly. It had arrived in layers, month by month, rail line by rail line, harvest by harvest, until the civilian population found itself trapped inside a system that could no longer feed, protect, or even properly count its own people. From 1942 onward, Allied bombing had steadily dismantled Germany's industrial spine. What began as precision attacks against factories and oil facilities expanded into a sustained campaign against transportation hubs, marshalling yards, and canals. By late 1944, the Reichsbahn, once a logistical miracle of Europe, operated at a fraction of its capacity. Coal did not reach cities. Grain did not reach mills. Potatoes froze in fields because trucks never arrived. Food rationing, introduced early in the war, had already been tightened repeatedly. Bread, meat, fat, sugar, each was reduced in grams that seemed small on paper but catastrophic over months. Official ration cards still existed, but by 1945 they were often meaningless. Shops had nothing to issue. Farmers hoarded what they could. Black markets flourished, then collapsed under scarcity. The winter of 1944-45 was especially severe. In bombed-out urban centers like Cologne, Kassel, and Wurzburg, civilians lived in basements amid rubble, burning furniture for heat. Malnutrition became visible everywhere. Swollen faces, brittle hair, lethargy. Medical reports from German hospitals described rising cases of edema and starvation-related illness, particularly among children and the elderly. Yet hunger alone does not explain the shock that awaited German civilians when American troops arrived. For 12 years, the Nazi state had cultivated a precise image of the enemy. American soldiers were portrayed as brutal, racially degenerate, undisciplined, driven by greed and cruelty. Newsreels warned of looting, violence, and moral collapse wherever the Anglo-American armies advanced. Leaflets and radio broadcasts insisted that surrender meant humiliation or death. As the Western Front crumbled after the Normandy landings in June 1944, this propaganda intensified. By autumn, entire towns were ordered to resist to the last man, woman, and child. Volkssturm units, often elderly men and teenage boys, were mobilized with little training and almost no food. Civilians internalized the fear. Diaries recovered after the war described families preparing poison, hiding daughters, or planning suicide rather than face occupation. Many expected revenge for years of bombing. Others feared starvation would worsen once enemy armies arrived. Meanwhile, Germany's agricultural base had been hollowed out. Millions of farm workers were conscripted or killed. Forced laborers and prisoners of war filled the gap, but yields declined. Fertilizer was diverted to explosives production. Horses were slaughtered for meat, leaving fields untilled. By early 1945, the Reich no longer possessed the means to sustain its population. Even before American troops crossed the Rhine in March, starvation was no longer a future threat. It was present reality. And it was into this collapsing civilian landscape, shaped by hunger, fear, and years of deliberate deception, that American soldiers advanced, carrying with them a logistical system unlike anything Europe had ever seen. That system, and the orders governing how it would be used, would determine whether occupation meant punishment or something entirely unexpected. While Germany's food system disintegrated, the American army approaching its borders represented the opposite reality, an industrial force built on abundance, planning, and redundancy. From the earliest days of U.S. involvement in the war, logistics had been treated not as a secondary concern, but as a decisive weapon. American planners understood that modern war will be won as much by supply tonnage as by battlefield maneuver. Every rifleman advancing into Europe carried not only ammunition, but calories measured and calculated months in advance. By 1944, the U.S. Army supply chain stretched from American farms to European front lines. Wheat from Kansas, beef from Texas, powdered milk from the Midwest, all processed, packaged, and shipped across the Atlantic in quantities that dwarfed anything the German system could still produce. Even after the destruction of ports and railways in France, the flow continued through temporary harbors, truck convoys, and pipeline networks. Central to the individual soldier's survival was standardized field rations. The K ration, introduced in 1942, was designed for short-term use during combat operations. Compact and calorie-dense, it contained biscuits, canned meat, chocolate, chewing gum, and coffee or bouillon powder. The C ration, heavier but more filling, included stew, meat and beans, bread, and sometimes fruit. By early 1945, millions of these meals moved forward with the advancing armies. American soldiers often complained about the monotony of these rations. Diaries and letters described frustration with powdered eggs and canned meat. Yet compared to the civilians they encountered, the contrast was stark. An American infantryman might receive 3,000 calories a day, sometimes more. A German civilian, officially, was entitled to less than half that amount, if it could be found at all. This imbalance was not accidental. U.S. occupation planning had begun long before the first soldier crossed into Germany. Allied leaders debated how to prevent another post-war collapse like that following World War I. At the same time, they feared appearing lenient toward a population that had supported a brutal regime. The result was a complex set of directives. Soldiers were strictly forbidden from looting. Discipline was enforced. Rations were issued for military personnel only. Yet humanitarian considerations were never entirely absent. Army manuals acknowledged that widespread starvation could lead to chaos, disease, and resistance. Medical unit prepared for civilian emergencies. Liaison officers coordinated with the Red Cross. On the ground, however, reality rarely followed doctrine precisely. As American units pushed through German towns in March and April 1945, contact with civilians was unavoidable. Families appeared at roadblocks. Children followed columns. Elderly men begged silently. Many had not eaten properly in days. No formal order instructed American soldiers to share their food. In fact, doing so risked disciplinary action if it compromised unit readiness. And yet, countless after-action reports, memoirs, and oral histories record the same pattern. Individual soldiers, confronted with visible hunger, made personal decisions. They opened ration tins. They broke bread. They handed chocolate to children who had never tasted it. For German civilians, conditioned to expect cruelty, this behavior was not merely kind. It was incomprehensible. It contradicted everything they had been told about the enemy. It disrupted the moral logic of total war. And for the soldiers themselves, these moments marked a quiet turning point, a transition from combatant to occupier, from destroyer to reluctant witness of civilian collapse. To understand why these brief exchanges carried such weight, it is necessary to examine the event from multiple angles, not as a single act of generosity, but as a convergence of human need, military culture, and shattered belief systems. By the time American units entered most German towns, civilian life had been reduced to its most basic instincts. Survival was no longer abstract. It was visible in bodies, in the way people moved slowly, conserving energy, in the way children no longer cried loudly because hunger had dulled even that reflex. Women carried responsibility for entire households. Many men were dead, missing, or still at the front. Diaries from cities like Aachen and Trier described mothers diluting soup until it was nearly clear, feeding children first, then going without. The elderly, often living alone after evacuations, survived on turnips or dried beet pulp meant for animals. When American soldiers appeared, civilians did not rush forward. They watched from doorways, from behind carts, from shattered stairwells. Fear restrained them as much as hunger. Nazi propaganda had insisted that any display of need would be punished. And yet, when food was offered without demand, without paperwork or conditions, it triggered a psychological rupture. Many civilians later described the moment not as relief, but as disbelief. Chocolate, unheard of for years. Coffee, real coffee, not acorns or substitutes. Bread that did not crumble into dust. For some children, these rations marked their first memory of the war's end, even before any official announcement. American soldiers had endured their own deprivation. Long marches, sleepless nights, the constant awareness that the next street might be defended. By March 1945, combat fatigue was widespread. Casualty lists were long. Units were under orders to keep moving. Yet, face-to-face with hunger, many soldiers hesitated. Letters home reveal internal conflict, resentment toward Germany's role in the war, mixed with empathy for civilians who clearly held no weapons. Some soldiers were the sons of immigrants. Others had grown up during the Great Depression and recognized the signs of starvation immediately. There was no script for these encounters. No command shouted. Just individual decisions made in silence. For German civilians, the act of sharing rations carried a symbolic weight far beyond nutrition. It contradicted 12 years of state-controlled imagery. The enemy was not supposed to kneel. He was not supposed to give. He was supposed to punish. This sudden inversion left many struggling to reconcile belief with experience. Some refused the food at first, suspecting poison or trickery. Others accepted it and wept, not only from hunger, but from the realization that they had been deceived. These moments did not erase years of war, but they cracked the ideological shell that had enclosed German society. And once that shell fractured, its collapse accelerated rapidly. That collapse, however, did not occur uniformly. The meaning of ration sharing changed depending on command structure, logistics, and the broader strategic environment. Forces that shape how often mercy could appear without undermining military discipline. From a strictly military perspective, food was a resource to be controlled, not distributed. U.S. Army regulations emphasized self-sufficiency, speed, and unit cohesion. Rations were calculated precisely, enough to sustain soldiers through combat without dependence on local supply. This doctrine prevented looting and reduced friction with civilians, but it also placed clear limits on generosity. Yet the American logistical system allowed a margin of flexibility unknown to most armies in 1945. Supply depots often held surplus. Units rotated off the line carried extra rations. In many towns, soldiers found themselves with more food than immediate operational needs required. Sharing a single ration rarely threatened combat effectiveness. Commanders understood this implicitly. While formal orders discouraged indiscriminate distribution, enforcement varied. Officers frequently turned a blind eye, recognizing that controlled compassion could stabilize occupied areas, reduce civilian panic, and prevent disease outbreaks that might affect troops. Leadership culture within the U.S. Army played a decisive role. Training emphasized discipline, but also restraint. War crime committed early in the conflict, in Europe and the Pacific, had reinforced the importance of lawful conduct. Soldiers were reminded that occupation behavior would shape post-war outcomes. Some commanders explicitly encouraged humane treatment, even if unofficially. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's directives stressed the importance of maintaining order without cruelty. Civil affairs units were embedded with combat formations to manage civilian contact, repair utilities, and coordinate relief once combat ended. The sharing of rations, while often spontaneous, aligned with these broader principles. It projected control rather than weakness. For German civilians, the Western Allies were supposed to embody vengeance. Years of total war had erased the idea of honorable conduct in defeat. Many expected confiscation of remaining food, not distribution. When American soldiers offered rations, it created cognitive dissonance. If the enemy was capable of mercy, what did that say about the war itself? About the leaders who had demanded total sacrifice? This question spread quietly, from household to household. The Second World War was defined by scale. Millions mobilized, millions killed. Individual acts were often swallowed by statistics. Yet it is precisely because of this scale that small gestures stood out so sharply. A soldier handing bread to a starving child did not change the strategic outcome, but it altered memory. It shaped how occupation was experienced. It humanized victory. These acts occurred not because war allowed them, but because individuals chose to assert moral agency within it. That choice would soon be tested on a larger scale, as advancing American armies crossed deeper into Germany and the war reached its irreversible turning point, a moment when defeat became undeniable and civilian contact intensified across the collapsing Reich. March 7, 1945. Reimagines, on the Rhine River. When American troops of the U.S. 9th Armored Division reached the Ludendorff Bridge and found it still standing, the war in Western Germany entered its final phase. Within hours, infantry crossed into the German heartland. The psychological barrier that had protected the Reich for centuries was gone. As bridgeheads expanded and armored columns fan outward, contact with civilians multiplied rapidly. Towns that had lived under constant air raid sirens now faced foreign soldiers in their streets, not retreating, not negotiating, but advancing steadily, methodically, without panic. In places like Andernach, Koblenz, and small villages along the Moselle, the pattern repeated. Civilians emerged cautiously, often holding white cloths. They were thin. Many were barefoot. Most had not eaten a full meal in days. American after-action reports from March described large numbers of displaced persons and civilians in weakened condition. Medical officers noted widespread malnutrition. Children fainted while standing. The elderly collapsed from exhaustion. Combat units were still under threat. Snipers fired from upper floors. Isolated resistance continued. Yet between bursts of danger, moments of stillness appeared, moments when soldiers encountered civilians not as obstacles, but as human beings. In one documented incident near the Rhine, soldiers halted briefly to reorganize. A group of women stood nearby, watching. No one spoke. One soldier opened a sea ration can and divided the contents. Another poured water into a helmet and mixed coffee powder. The women accepted the food silently, some nodding, others unable to meet the soldiers' eyes. These acts spread unevenly but persistently as American forces pushed east. By late March, entire regions of Western Germany were under U.S. control. The Ruhr, the industrial heart of the Reich, was encircled. Millions of civilians were now cut off from what little distribution system remained. As the front stabilized temporarily, American units began holding ground rather than racing forward. With that shift came longer periods of civilian interaction at checkpoints, in town squares, near field kitchens. The ration sharing, once occasional, became more visible. Red Cross observers recorded instances of U.S. soldiers giving food to children despite explicit shortages. Chaplains reported soldiers seeking guidance, asking whether feeding civilians violated orders or conscience. At the same time, German civilian fear began to shift. The expected wave of retribution did not come. Homes were searched, weapons confiscated, curfews imposed, but systematic brutality did not follow. Instead, hunger remained the dominant enemy. The turning point was no longer about military victory alone. It was about how that victory would be lived, hour by hour, by a defeated population, and whether restraint could hold amid devastation. That question would be answered as American forces advanced deeper into southern and central Germany, where the collapse was even more complete, and the moral stakes even higher. April 1945. As American armies pushed beyond the Rhine, resistance collapsed unevenly. Some units fought to the last cartridge. Others dissolved without orders. Entire German divisions vanished into forests or surrendered en masse. What remained behind them was a civilian population stripped of structure, leadership, and supply. In Bavaria, Franconia, and Thuringia, regions spared the worst early bombing but now overwhelmed by refugees. The humanitarian crisis deepened rapidly. Columns of displaced people clogged roads. Former forced laborers, concentration camp survivors, and German civilians competed for shelter and food that did not exist. American troops encountered starvation on a scale few had anticipated. Medical detachments documented towns where caloric intake had fallen below survival thresholds. In some villages, livestock had been slaughtered months earlier. Seed grain had been eaten. People boiled grass, nettles, or wallpaper paste. Children showed signs of advanced malnutrition, distended abdomens, weakened immune systems. In this environment, ration sharing ceased to be symbolic and became urgent. Field kitchens began feeding civilians informally. Soldiers passed food through windows. Officers coordinated with local leaders to identify the most vulnerable. These actions were not uniform nor officially standardized, but they were widespread enough to be recorded across multiple units. The reaction among civilians was profound. For many Germans, this was the first direct experience with the outside world after years of isolation. The enemy spoke calmly. He did not shout. He ate the same food he offered. The feared conqueror behaved like a caretaker, not always gently, not always patiently, but with restraint. This shift altered behavior. Civilians began approaching American positions openly. White flags disappeared. Children gathered near vehicles. Requests replaced silence. Command response evolved quickly. Civil affairs units expanded operations. Emergency feeding programs were authorized. Coordination with international relief organizations increased. The U.S. Army recognized that preventing mass starvation was not an act of charity, it was a strategic necessity. By late April, as American and Soviet forces closed in from opposite sides, Germany's fate was sealed. Hitler was dead. Berlin was surrounded. In the West, surrender was imminent. But for civilians in American-occupied zones, the defining memory of those final weeks was not the collapse of a regime. It was the moment when expected cruelty failed to arrive. When rations were shared, something intangible shifted. The war did not end in documents or signatures for those people. It ended when hunger met an open hand. The consequences of that choice, made in countless streets, kitchens, and checkpoints, would shape the occupation that followed and the long psychological aftermath of defeat. The surrender of German forces in May 1945 did not bring immediate relief to the civilian population. In many respects, the weeks after the fighting ended were more dangerous than the final battles themselves. Germany's infrastructure lay in ruins. An estimated one-fifth of all housing in major cities had been destroyed. Rail networks were fractured. Bridges were down. Warehouses were empty. Even where food existed in the countryside, there were no reliable means to transport it. Hunger remained widespread. Allied military governments quickly assessed the scale of the crisis. Surveys conducted in the American zone revealed caloric intake in some areas as low as 800 to 1,000 calories per day, levels associated with slow starvation. Hospitals reported soaring mortality among infants and the elderly. Tuberculosis and typhus threatened to spread through displaced populations. The informal ration sharing that had occurred during combat now fed directly into policy debates. American commanders faced a dilemma. Public opinion at home demanded firmness. Germany was widely viewed as responsible for unprecedented destruction and genocide, yet allowing civilians to starve risked humanitarian catastrophe, instability, and moral failure. In response, emergency measures were introduced. U.S. Army stocks were reallocated. Field kitchens expanded. Civil affairs officers organized feeding centers in urban areas. Priority was given to children, pregnant women, and the sick. These programs were limited. They did not erase hunger, but they slowed the collapse. German civilians responded with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Diaries from the summer of 1945 describe relief tempered by shame. Many struggled with the knowledge that survival now depended on the former enemy. Others expressed quiet admiration for the discipline and restraint of American forces. Importantly, these measures also stabilized the occupation. Areas receiving food saw reduced unrest, fewer thefts, and greater cooperation. American patrols encountered less hostility. Trust, fragile and uneven, began to form. Yet the legacy of ration sharing extended beyond immediate survival. It influenced how defeat was internalized. Instead of total humiliation enforced through starvation, the American approach introduced a paradox: punishment of a regime without collective annihilation of its people. That distinction mattered deeply, even if it was not fully understood at the time. As occupation structures solidified, the question shifted from emergency relief to long-term recovery, and how the early moral tone set by individual soldiers would shape policy, memory, and international relationships in the years to come. As the summer of 1945 progressed, the American occupation zone settled into a fragile equilibrium. Hunger did not disappear, but it was no longer the dominant force governing daily life in every town. Relief was uneven and often insufficient, yet the worst-case scenario, mass civilian starvation on a scale comparable to wartime sieges, was averted. This outcome was not inevitable. Internal Allied debates reveal how close policy came to taking a harsher path. Early post-war planning had considered strict limits on German industrial recovery and food imports. The fear was that any leniency would allow old militarism to resurface. But conditions on the ground forced reassessment. Reports from U.S. medical officers, Red Cross personnel, and civil affairs units made clear that civilian collapse would endanger occupation forces and poison any attempt at democratic reconstruction. By late 1945, the American approach began to shift from containment to stabilization. Food imports increased modestly. Agricultural production was encouraged rather than suppressed. Programs such as school feeding initiatives were expanded. These policies were not acts of forgiveness. They were pragmatic responses to reality. The memory of American soldiers sharing rations played a subtle but persistent role in shaping civilian attitudes. Oral histories collected in the decades after the war repeatedly returned to those early encounters. The enemy who had been expected to brutalize instead fed. This contrast became even sharper when compared with conditions in other occupation zones. In the East, where Soviet forces bore the scars of devastating losses, requisitioning and forced labor left a very different imprint. Refugees who crossed into American zones often described ration sharing as the first sign of safety they had experienced in years. For American veterans, these moments also lingered. Many later reflected that feeding civilians was one of the few actions that felt unequivocally right in a war defined by destruction. It offered a sense of closure, a way to end the conflict without further harm. Over time, these interactions contributed to a broader transformation. The relationship between occupier and occupied evolved into cooperation. Former enemies rebuilt together. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1947, institutionalized a logic-first practice informally on shattered streets. That stability, not starvation, was a foundation of lasting peace. The sharing of rations did not erase guilt or suffering. It did not absolve crimes. But it demonstrated an alternative path at the precise moment when history could have hardened into bitterness. That choice, repeated thousands of times by ordinary soldiers, shaped not only the occupation, but the moral narrative that followed, a narrative that invites reflection on how wars truly end. In the ruins of Germany, small acts revealed a truth the battlefield could not. War is measured not only in victories, but in the choices left to those who survive it. The soldiers who offered bread, chocolate, or coffee did so without fanfare. No orders demanded it, no medals awaited. Yet in those moments, humanity persisted where ideology, propaganda, and violence had failed. Civilians confronted an enemy who behaved contrary to every warning they had received, and in that contradiction, they glimpsed a possibility of a world beyond fear. History often records armies, strategies, and weapons, but the lasting impact of these encounters lay in memory. A child's first bite of real chocolate, a mother's quiet relief at a shared ration, the stunned recognition that not all power is exercised through cruelty. These moments, multiplied across towns and villages, softened the moral landscape of defeat and allowed reconstruction to begin not only physically, but psychologically. The lesson endures. Even amid total war, individual choices can ripple far beyond immediate survival. Discipline guided by conscience, abundance tempered by generosity, and restraint exercised at the right moment can redefine how conflict is remembered. For the German civilians who had known only deprivation, and for the soldiers who extended unexpected mercy, those ration tins were more than food. They were the first fragile sign of peace. War, in its grand scale, often obscures the human thread. But here, in quiet streets and shattered towns, that thread remained unbroken.